We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Welcome to Finances, your home for all things financial, investment, money and lifestyle. Hosted and curated by the very talented team of certified financial planners, Burke Britton Financial Partners. So we wanted to start, we've got a few things, we might not get to all of them today. If we don't, we'll carry them over to the next podcast, but we were going to talk a little bit about how people go about finding financial advisors and what to anticipate, what to expect when you come in, or first of all, when you're trying to find someone. And this relates fairly heavily to why we're actually doing this podcast. So why we're actually doing the podcast in the first place is to actually give another avenue for people to get access to quality information by qualified people that they can then take themselves, not necessarily, we need to be careful, not taking this as advice, but taking it as information that allows them to make an informed decision about whether or not they should be seeking advice or not. And so I read an article, and I might read the article, and if it's too long-winded, I'll just cut it out of the podcast. So it was from Money Management, July 29 to 2021 by Jasmine Go, called Wealth Coaches and Finfluencers Next Bubble to Burst. So I'll read it and we can comment on it and expand on what this means for us as financial advisors. So wealth coaches and finfluencers will be the next bubble to burst, and financial planners will bear the brunt of any wrongdoing. The Financial Planning Association of Australia, FPA, believes. FPA Chief Executive Dante DeGori said, he's now resigned, I believe, is that right?
Yeah, he has.
Yep. Said the latest danger and risk to come out of the increasing cost of advice was the emergence of wealth coaches, finfluencers, and advisors getting into the wholesale game to avoid obligation and regulatory red tape. One main reason of this emergence is that it's too costly and complicated to deliver those services in the current regime. Planners should be able to service consumers at any price point they wish, as it is their business models. And again, we don't have to force advisors to service low-income earners, but there should be business models that cater for that, DeGori said. If there's a wrongdoing by a wealth coach or a finfluencer, I've never heard that until now, in the wholesale space, it's going to come back to the planning space, and financial planners will bear the brunt. And that's irrespective of who's involved. And we shouldn't kid ourselves thinking that won't happen. DeGori said those operating outside the regime had no statutory obligation to act in their clients' best interests, and that they were not watched by the corporate regulatory, so consumers had no protection or compensation. DeGori said that there was a role for wealth coaches in terms of educating consumers who want to do things themselves, to help verify things, or to have someone coach them along without necessarily giving them advice. He noted that there were always going to be Australians priced out of private financial advice, but that in industries like medicine, there was the Medicare system, and in law, there was legal aid. We think it should be a human right for Australians should get advice on finances and get financial control of their situation, and to have access to qualified financial planner, he said. At the bottom end, where people are in financial and debt crisis, there are financial counsellors. Then there's the point where financial counsellors won't intervene. That gap is a group of Australians who, depending on what decisions they make, could be the next group that get into financial distress. But if they make the right decisions, they could be on their way to getting control of their finances, but they're not in a position where they can afford a financial planner. DeGori said this space could be filled with not-for-profit advice and be funded through a combination of government and industry that would fund a pool of advisors to give pro bono or to work in this space full-time to give advice to Australians who could not afford to get advice. There's a precedent here in the UK. They've done this model specifically to assist pensions advice. Something similar could be started here in terms of retirement, what to do between accumulation and starting your pension. So I read that in the sauna this morning, Ben, and
So it's a bit soggy still. A bit of sweat all over it.
It is.
I won't borrow a copy.
It's drenched in sweat. But it sort of got me thinking a little bit about that space. And I think that space for me is what I've recognised being in the industry for 20 years is the space where you want to be able to give people need access to information to be able to make an informed decision. And for someone to make the leap from no information to all of a sudden paying a fee for advice is, in many instances, a big bridge to gap, or a big gap to bridge.
I think this podcast is almost both sides of it. And I think I've seen and followed pages, Facebook's, Instagram's, podcasts where they start out with the intention of providing this sort of gap filler to get people up to it. And then they end up getting a bit, I don't know what it is, if it's an ego thing, but by the end of it, they're pumping out personal advice pieces to people that aren't ready or aren't. It's not personal in nature. It's a general in nature, and people are applying it across the board. And there's one that I follow, which I quite like reading, but it's sort of gone down the path now of telling people where to put their super and how to invest it. And they started out providing sort of market information and general information to get people thinking about it, which is a good thing. But it's a slippery slope, a dangerous slippery slope. And I do fear where those people end up, and I fear it'll cost more to fix it than what they create.
Yeah. I think someone like you who's educated can listen to that, and you can sort of dissect it well enough to make, you've got enough information to be able to make an informed decision about, oh, that's not for me, that's not relevant. That person that comes into that and they hear that as advice. So what we want to do, particularly with our conversations, is, again, make it very clear that what we're talking about here is not advice, but we want to give people agency to make informed decisions themselves. And I'm very big on personal responsibility. I know in that article we're talking about those people that really, there's always got to be a safety net for people that just fall through the cracks and really don't have the capability to be able to deal with their own circumstances. But a large portion of the population, it really is just about taking personal ownership and control. And if we can give people a bit of a stepping stone from listening to information that allows them to make an informed choice, then to maybe engage with someone to talk about their own personal circumstances, from that conversation, work out whether it's then appropriate to go ahead and pay for some advice, I think that's a really safe stepping stone for people. Like, it gives them a progression from knowing nothing to knowing a little bit, to talking about their personal circumstances, to actually getting specific advice.
I think people want to be able to handball all their responsibility and input to it, but realistically, you've got to own it yourself to an extent before you're going to be ready to really get the value of advice as well. Like, you got to know where your shit's at. Like, people don't even know how many bank accounts, things like that, what they've got. So they come in so raw that they just don't get the outcomes they want. And then they probably get a bit pissy about the cost of it because they're just so far off the mark of where they need to be. So, it's like most things, you just got to assess what you've got, takes control to the point where you're comfortable and knowledgeable enough to do so, and then get the professionals in around that.
So maybe let's talk to the process of someone out there that's looking, they're starting to contemplate actually seeking some sort of advice. What are the types of things that we're encouraging them to do? Like, what's the very first port of call? And if they're listening to this is probably that first port of call. They've been curious enough to tune in and listen to a couple of guys talk rubbish for half an hour or so. Beyond that, where do people go beyond that?
I suppose there's lots of different ways they can go with it. I think the first thing is assess what you've got yourself and then work out what you're trying to achieve. So if you don't know what you've got, look at people come in and you ask them what they're earning, they don't even know. So first of all, maybe it's a bit boring of me, maybe it's the accounting background, but once a month I write down everything I've got and see what it was the month before. And that might sound boring, but
golf clubs,
all the assets, new phone, anything like that. But just to know, have some awareness of where you're at and to just take stock of it. I think that's the first thing you do, and then you try and work out where your areas are of what I need to improve on. And then, again, there's plenty of stuff that we'll talk about here that you can put in place yourself. And that's not, I think people want the panacea in terms of go and buy Bitcoin, but realistically, it's got to be about building some basic systems and some, having some restraint themselves.
Basic
systems and processes. It's people probably just all turned off now. But having your own system, and I think I say to people, everyone's system's a bit different. There's not going to be the cookie cutter. And that's, people think you've got to have 5 accounts with 4 of them labelled as this. For some people, that works well. For some people, it doesn't. You got to find what works for you. Do your research. It sounds like a dangerous anti-vaxxer sort of sentiment. But what would you do? I think you got to take stock of what you've got first.
Yep.
And then move forward.
Well, I always go to the things that we ask in our first meeting with a client. Yep. The things we ask about their marital status. So that should be easy you should be able to identify that relatively easily. Dependencies, income, cash flow, assets, liabilities, estate planning, insurance, what you'd want to happen in the event that you passed. Like, if you don't know what some of those terminologies mean, then that's probably your first port of call. So I've got to do a little bit of homework on what's an asset, what's a liability, what does cash flow mean, what is budgeting. And that's cool. If you're not there yet, that's okay. That's stuff you can take control of yourself to have a basic understanding. So when we sit down with someone, as you know, Ben, when we sit down with someone, we try and gather at a high level an understanding of their overall situation. We start to sort of piece together the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and then align that to what they might say their sort of financial and lifestyle objectives are. What we know for sure is that most people come in not really knowing what their financial and lifestyle objectives are. And that part of our role and part of the value that we add is trying to actually help extract from people what they're trying to achieve. Like, where do they want their kids to go? How do they want their small business to look? What would happen in the event that, they lost their income or a family member was to pass? So starting to piece together that picture of what their life looks like now versus what they want it to look like from a financial and lifestyle perspective in the future. And again, you can do some homework in readiness for maybe sitting down with a financial advisor. You can do some homework. All the things that you spoke about, you can actually get your house in order enough so that you can make productive use of that first time you sit down with a planner.
It would just springboard you into that meeting. So you're coming into it thinking about the right things rather than just sitting there spending, paying your money to sit there and work through a balance sheet of what you've got. You're already a step ahead. I think I find so many people come in and they have a solution in mind, but the solutions, they don't even know what the problem is. So people come in and go, I want to buy some shares or I want to buy an investment property. And they think that that's their goal, but that's not the goal. That's just a solution or a possible solution. And then you unpack it and you realize you can't be, they're 10 steps ahead of where they need to be. They need to work out, well, is it a financial motivation for passive income, or you want that to be an asset that you pass on in your estate planning? What is the actual goal of that act? Why are you doing it? And people get a bit annoyed sometimes when you start to go, what? Why is that? But pretty quickly, you don't often get past the second or third why, and they realize why you're asking the question. Yeah. And that sort of you come in fundamentally wrong in terms of the order. And that's fine because you don't know that. People don't know that. People hear and read, and whether it's from their, whatever you call them, financial fluencers or whatever. Finfluencers. They've been told build a property portfolio and that'll be the gateway to financial freedom. And they're pretty smart because they throw those terms around like financial freedom a lot. But that's, again, is that the best way forward for that person? What are the risks associated? All the boring stuff that we dig into. But
our job's to make sense of that mess. Yeah. And the uncertainty that people have and the gaps in their knowledge. Our job is to fill those gaps and then make sure that they've got a structure. And I was thinking about the process. I'm thinking about how people actually come to see us. And this could be any financial advisor, but most people find us via word of mouth. They find us via word of mouth from existing clients who have loved what we've done for them, or they've Google reviewed us, or they've jumped on Facebook and done a review. From that point, so there's a bit of, I suppose, social credit, social currency in seeking someone from word of mouth. And that's probably the first thing I'd say. If you are sort of seeking advice and you want to go and speak to an actual human, is you should ask questions. You should take some responsibility and actually ask some people that you actually know. Thanks, Ben's taking social media snaps as we're talking. But you should actually go and see who's actually doing a good job in your community, or who is it that you know that can highly recommend someone. The next step for us when people actually come to the table and sit down with us is that we have a conversation. That conversation, Ben, depending upon the person and the complexity of their situation, can be 15 minutes. It could be 3 hours.
It depends just where they're at and what. Yeah, it varies. People can't expect it to be a cookie cutter system. Like maybe that first meeting does go for 3 hours because you really get into the groove of things and it's working. Where maybe they just need to go away and actually reassess that first phase of things, come back in a better position. There's no point pushing through it if they're not going to get the value of it. So again, you can come in as prepared as possible. You get the best value for money, the best outcome, the best progression from there. But it's not a linear process. It's different for everyone. I've had so many clients, we had the meeting. For 12 months, we probably didn't change anything because they just needed time to process it, work out what they wanted to do, and it sort of clicked for them at a point. And then now they're flying because they've realised, and it's sort of had a bit of an epiphany for them. And then they come back and now you're doing all those things and they start to embrace it and it works for them. But it's a huge trust exercise as much as anything. And I think that's where the word of mouth thing works so well, is that their niece or their auntie or their brother or their friend has said, we trust what they're doing. And they come in a lot more warm, and that works really well for everyone from the outset. But we understand that it's a massive decision. It's usually their biggest financial decision they ever make is to actually hand over that trust. And it's a consultation thing. It's not like, here's $1 million, go and work your hardest with it and do what you can. It's about working out, well, what do you want from it?
Well, maybe it's worth just touching on for us, and let's talk in this business, what our first meeting is. Because as you said, at that point, we're not giving advice, and we're not taking that $1 million that someone has, or the 10 grand that someone has, or the super consolidations they have, and doing something right there. It's a consultative process that sets up whether or not that person is ready to move to the next phase of some formal planning, or if they well served enough just to take the general discussions that they've had and go and be in a better position as a result of having the conversation. So you want to maybe touch a little bit on that?
Again, I suppose it's not a catch and kill operation from our end. It needs to be correct, the relationship for both parties. So again, working through that process, a lot of it's just providing information and upskilling the person so they understand what they've got and what that means for them, what risks are actually present that they didn't know of. People, the old ones say, I don't want to invest in shares, and they've got 90% of their super funds in the share market and it didn't worry them, but they just didn't think about it. So, unpacking that, giving people knowledge of what they do and don't know about their own situation, and some self-awareness to go, right, I actually do need to do something here. Like, it's sort of, what is it? They're oblivious to it, so they just have no care for it. So the first meeting's almost just laying it on the table and us doing, that assessment of where the issues lie, or where the opportunities lie more so. There's often risks, we mitigate those, smooth them over, and look at where the room for improvement and growth is, and then pick the eyes out of that to improve it and make it even better and make sure it is doing its best possible, all working together. Often we have conflicting inputs, which makes it very difficult to meet your goals long term. So that initial process and meeting is, for some people, all they really needed to do was verbalize it. Like, they actually just needed to verbalize it.
They just needed to talk to someone.
Well, I had a meeting last week, and they came in, and they probably won't be doing anything for a little while, but they'd been sitting at home just talking about their options, about they've got a property, they want to get a bigger property, and there was just things they just weren't aware of, so that they were scoping their thought process incorrectly. So they didn't know what they could do, or they didn't think about it from an alternative perspective. So we probably spent an hour and a half just talking about it and just saying, well, you could do this or you could do that. And if you spent this, your debt would be this. And just, plugged a few general figures into a calculator and said, well, that's what your mortgage repayment would be. And they left being in a position where they thought, we need to go back and actually assess what we were trying to do. Like, we needed a bigger property, or we needed this, but working out what's that going to cost me, and here's the 5 different options I've got to get there. And again, that was more of just a general thing that they'll make that decision, but we were able to just get it out on the table, talk about it in a really general nature. It wasn't really an advice meeting. It was just a consultation, broadly a sounding board meeting. That's what I often say to them. I'm just be a sounding board at many times.
I think that value of being a sounding board, and I'll say this to clients and consistently, existing clients, new clients, is that the value, although there is a cost in the preparation of a financial plan, I believe firmly that the most value that someone will get is in the relationship they actually have with us, and the conversations that you can actually have that are long form in nature, that can go off on tangents, and then have someone like us to actually wrap that conversation up in a manner that you leave knowing where you need to be pointed. Like, the direction you need to be headed. And that sort of financial, I know that word financial counsel was thrown around a little bit but in that article, but I see us as that financial counsel, the someone that is the conduit through which you can access all the things of a financial nature, and then give you some clarity where there's uncertainty or mess. We've been talking for a little while on this topic, Ben. We might want to change tact slightly. Did you want to turn left, turn right?
I was going to say, I suppose maybe we'll move to the next sort of something that's topical with people coming in, and the next sort of phase of that. Maybe one of the areas would be, people getting that self-awareness, and they don't know what they don't know about what they've got already or what they're trying to achieve. So I think, again, this probably just ties into it a little bit, and we'll probably just play that out into some more targeted areas. But people don't know what it means, or they haven't even thought about the risks of not acting, or what happens if interest rates rise. That's probably the biggest one, where I think there are people that are conscious of it, but are they really aware of what that will mean, what risks will flow through to them? Does that impact their ability to put food on the table? Does it impact their ability to go out for dinner or go on a holiday or do the things that they actually want to do, the good stuff? So I think I sort of worry a little bit about the debt situation for
You're
some
a pessimist,
clients.
Ben. Look, what are you worried about? Just borrow to your maximum. It's okay. Just get 80, 90% of what you can borrow.
Must be my farming background. I was a little bit pessimistic. And
but I think it's called being a realist. I think somewhere between pessimism and optimism is that the right place to be.
I think the scary thing is we've seen when it goes wrong, how wrong it can go. And people think it will be okay, or they've been bailed out multiple times, and the last 18 months has probably been an interesting period because there's probably a lot of people that could have, should have, or did go under, and they've got bailed out by either government support or something, but that won't happen forever. And you've got to plan for those things, as boring as that sounds.
This comes back to what we said before about personal responsibility.
Yeah. Which is not as common these days. Like, you look back in time.
You sound like a real old timer now.
Sound like a Peter. I tried him. But there wasn't those support systems in place, and now people get annoyed when there's not. Like, but should they expect that, or should they not? Take control of it yourself. Like, have some simple. It's not even complicated. It's just having some simple things in place to know if I didn't get any income for the next 3 months, would I have enough in the bank to get me through a month of that, 2 months? What simple things where instead they see $50 in their account, well, they'll go and spend 49 of it, or they'll spend 100 and borrow the other 50 and know that they'll have 50 in a month's time they can pay it back, the other debt with. So that's a societal thing.
Yeah, and to be maybe the counter argument to that is that, and probably to your point, sort of contrary to your point, but to your point is that some people just not thinking about it. They're just not thinking about it. So they're not consciously aware. It's not at the forefront of their mind that they should be thinking about these things. Like, they're not thinking about the deferred reward of taking some responsibility today for their cash flow, or thinking, hey, shit, interest rates could rise. I've just borrowed to the maximum that the bank would lend me, and I'm good now, but what am I going to do in 3 years, 4 years' time? Do I actually have a plan? And one of the great things about, I think, what we do as financial planners is we look forward. Like, we actually look forward and project forward people's situation to anticipate the risks and the concerns that people might have, whether it is pending growth of a family or interest rate rises, like just trying to anticipate and put a layer of risk mitigation across someone's situation so that they're not having to worry about it every day, but we do have them covered.
I was going to say, I almost at times feel like we're just risk mitigators. As much as we're there to grow their wealth and their assets and their overall position, if you don't mitigate the risk and balance that, then you can't extend yourself. So as much as we're saying be conscious of your debt, there's times where debt's appropriate and it can leverage you into wealth. So you've got to assess both sides of that, weigh them up and have things in place. I often talk to clients now about, traditionally it was probably make sure you've got some life insurance. So if someone kicks the bucket, then there's a lump sum there. Now, that's just one tiny piece of that layered approach. I've sort of been saying using a tiered or a layered approach. So you've got cash in the bank, you've got redraw on your mortgage, you've got assets that are redeemable and liquid in nature, then you might have insurance after that. And there's other things you can build into. That's a very simple look at it. But if you ask people what they would do if they couldn't work for a week, month, 6 months, a year, they'd probably struggle to answer all those questions. Or they'd say, I'll get some Centrelink. But is that really a solution?
No, and getting people to the point where they've got multiple levers to pull.
Yeah.
And that's part of wealth creation, is getting to the point where insurance becomes less important. And that if you did have a debilitating illness or injury or death, that you are adequately self-insured. And so growing wealth has a multitude of benefits, one of them being that it gives you just another lever to pull in the event that things go pear-shaped.
I think that, again, we use a lot of the same terms probably because we talk about it a lot, but having levers and being able to pivot when things change, because inevitably things will change. And in the last period of time, these last couple of years, people's situations have gone... You
sound like a footy coach.
Negative.
Pivot and leverage. And
I wish I could play football. It's either got way better or way worse for them. Like, there isn't that many people that are sort of... There's some people that have sat in the middle, but for some people, their financial position has gone way, way better, and for some, it's way, way worse. So we've got to be able to pivot with that and make good use of the newfound cash flow, or we've got to change and pivot to be able to stem the bleeding for a period of time as well. So again, we probably don't value that ourselves enough, how much we do that or have things in place. And you hope you never use them. You even look at the investments last year, and we have a lot of retiree clients, and I didn't really I didn't worry what would happen because I knew that we had things in place. Like whether that be, they always had plenty of buffer there in their investments that they could pull down on. For some of them, it meant they could actually climb into the market and have an actual upswing out of that downturn. So again, if you have it set up correctly, the foundations, you don't have to be too stressed about it. And there's some people out there that are completely stressed out of their mind about their financial situation, but actually putting it on the table and talking about it's not that comfortable either.
But that's also one of the important parts of financial advice is that it's about having what they call it, passing the sleep test. It might be that your situation doesn't need to change, but talking about it gives you the comfort that you're okay. I think you mentioned right at the start or maybe off air at the beginning that some people don't even know that they're okay. Like people come in stressing out of their eyeballs about their financial situation, their ability to fund retirement, yet they're totally fine. They need to have confirmation that they're okay. And conversely, you've got people that have no idea that they're stuffed.
I've had people come in and they're 60 years old and they've got debt on their house still, modest super, and they say, I want to retire in 12 months.
Or I am retired.
Or I'm retired, or I lost my job, but I don't think I want to go back. And
with a cost of living of $80,000, $90,000 a year.
Generally, they all go hand in hand. Big mortgage, small super, high cost of living.
Want to retire next week.
Yeah. And they've lived in a bit of a fantasy land for a long period of time, and they've just kicked that can so far down the road that now it's arrived. Like they've actually arrived at retirement, or whether their body's given out on them, or mentally, physically, whatever it is, they can't work anymore. And they're going to go from living on 90 grand a year to maybe getting 15 grand a year from Centrelink to try and limp through. And that's all they're just surviving at that point. And our job is probably nigh on impossible at that point. Like the horse has bolted a bit.
Pitching a good argument for education for kids in school. I was thinking I might have talked about it one other time, but Kari, my wife, was laughing at me about giving Willow education or giving her a bit of not a lecture, but giving her a little bit of a tutorial on superannuation. She's got her first job. She's got her second job. Congratulations, Willow, Maccas. But the earlier you can ingrain or you can take personal responsibility, back to that earlier you can take personal responsibility on control and that you do have control and that you shouldn't just be waiting for a safety net to pick you up, you're going to be much better served. However you go about doing that, whether it's you research yourself and do that online, whether it is you come and sit down with an advisor to talk one-to-one about your circumstances, get your house in order. Understand all the things we've spoken about, income, cash flow, assets, liabilities, insurances. You're going to be in a much better position to make informed decisions as you go. I mean, we sound like broken records with this, but it's not a complicated thing. But either is being healthy, but not everyone does it because you've got to actually take the action. You've got to take that action to improve yourself.
The earlier in your life, your financial journey, you do that, the easier. Like I have clients who say, my son or daughter, they're only 18, they've just finished school and they got their first job. Would there be, is it too early to have a conversation? And I'll say no. Like if you can get that right through a conversation at the outset, it will set them up so much more. I've seen time after time people, you roll through uni living on 2-minute noodles and $1 loaves of bread, and then they get their first job and they're on 40, 50, 60 grand a year, and they quickly grow into that, and then they start getting pay rises and they just keep consuming it. And then they get to late 20s and they go, I want to buy a house, and they're living off everything and they've got nothing to show for their last 5 years of work and their years at uni. So they're starting, 5, 6, in some cases they're 10 years behind those that left school early and went and got an apprenticeship and probably had some habits in place earlier too. So the earlier you can get that in place and just do a little bit for a long time, it sounds so boring, but just repeat the action, little bit, long time. It doesn't mean you don't live, but you just do it all in moderation. Like it is like a diet. Like you've just got to spread that around.
We kind of sound like we've come back full circle to that original article, which is, again, the reason for this podcast, and actually giving people something that is at no cost, where they can listen to people that have an understanding of this world and you can absorb it. And we probably didn't, because we're doing the podcast, we didn't really talk about it. But this is one of the reasons why we continue to think that this is valuable for people not only in the early part of their financial journey, but even if you're experienced in finances, to actually hear other people talk from a different viewpoint about things of a financial nature. So if you're listening to this today and you think someone could benefit from it, then forward it on, flick it on. What else we got today, Ben? You had self-managed super
Yeah,
funds.
I was going to say maybe we'll take a little bit of a turn into the solution mode, I suppose, potentially a little bit, but just something that's very, very topical. And I think more and more people ask this question. They come in and they say, do I need a self-managed super fund? And I think, first of all, we probably have to unpack what that means, because it's a bit of a loose term, self-managed super fund. And I'm not sure who came up with the name of it, but I think most of the time when we see people that are self-managing, unless they're a professional,
it's a terrible name, isn't
it's
it?
a horrible name. I'd prefer to call it a family fund, or I'm not sure what the best term for it is, but
I think it was
self-managed is not a good one.
We should we'll make a note of that. We might actually do a bit of research and come back where that name came from. I'm tipping that it came from
probably an
accountant that were self-managing, because that pretty much in the early days were the only people that had self-managed super funds were people that could actually self-manage it. And there is definitely a lot of misinformation or
just misunderstanding. It's a complex word. I say to people often, I wish you could do more of this yourself, but quite simply, it's complicated. And that's why they need us to do that, from literally setting things up, getting the mechanics of it right, without even digging into all the terminology and risks associated with that. So a self-managed super fund just sort of probably doubles all of those things, because you take on more burden as the member, the trustee, you are the everything.
Yeah, well,
so you need to bolt people on around you to help with those tasks.
So maybe let's talk. And again, our caveat is that this is obviously not advice, and I think we've got a disclaimer at the end of our podcast that says that. We might put it at the start as well. But a self-managed super fund, so a couple of the distinctions between a self-managed super fund and what most people are aware of or used to in terms of super, is that a self-managed super fund, you are the trustee of that money. So you are the trustee of your own super fund, which means you are the responsible entity for making decisions around that money, which means if you stuff it up, it's your fault. So if you're in Australian Super, or you're in, name a super fund, if you're in any super fund where it's not a self-managed, they are the responsible entity. So if they get the accounting wrong, or they do something that's not in line with the guidelines, it's their responsibility. They have to mop up the damage. If it's with a self-managed super fund, it comes with an extra burden of responsibility. So with that said, people think, well, why the hell would I want a self-managed super fund if I don't want all that responsibility? Part of the answer is that a lot of people do want that responsibility, and they do want that control over their own money. They don't want someone else managing and making decisions around how their money's invested. So there's this balancing act of then finding whether or not a self-managed super fund is appropriate to you. And there is no one size fits all. It depends on a number of things. And those things, Ben, are...
Well, in terms of, you just throw that straight to me. I was going to say one of the biggest issues with it is that there's costs associated, the scale of the fund, responsibilities, time burden. So
type of asset that you're going to own.
Yeah. Do you need it? And I think in the past, traditionally, super funds were very much a managed fund sort of environment. So you threw your money in, it went into a managed option. Someone behind the scenes managed that money, and there was probably a perception that they didn't have a link to it, a care for it. They were making their money by flicking shares around inside of it. And people don't like that lack of transparency. I don't like it either. I prefer to know what I've got and why I've got it. Probably the people then took the leap into self-managed funds, where they sort of run their own race, buy their own shares, know what they've got, control it, make those decisions themselves. But there's so many sort of intermediate options now as well, where you can have transparency, you can know what you've got, have some say and control over it without, layering yourself up with time, costs, responsibility. And that's where people generally fall down, because it's all right at the start. But when you're working 45 hours a week and then you got to spend a couple of hours a week trying to manage your self-managed super fund investments, it's often not your first choice when you go home.
And the administration around it.
And then you've got to do a tax return and an audit and pay ASIC a fee for the company that might sit underneath it, and all those things that go into it. So it becomes, again, self-managed is a poorly used terminology. The pros of it, there's a massive amount of it. We're very much pro self-managed super fund where appropriate. I think generally the ATO, I think it's 200,000 is their sort of flag. If you set one up with less than that, they're going to come knocking and ask why are you doing that, because the scale there is. And
I think we could safely say on the podcast here that even we would think that scale is way too low, way too low with economies of scale for people to benefit from a self-managed super fund. And again, everyone's different, but we're looking at pushing beyond $750,000 plus as where the numbers start to look more favourable towards a family or a self-managed super fund.
Yeah, and that's because you've got, and very simply without bogging people down in the numbers, is you essentially have a fixed cost to run that fund. So once you've got, you know what the tax return costs, you know what the input costs are to maintain it, the scale grows and the costs don't grow with it. Whereas with most super funds, they charge on a percentage basis for the admin and things. So if you've got a modest balance, you pay a modest fee. And as your balance grows, you pay a lot more. So you get to a point where you sort of tip over. And by fixing the costs, you get a better outcome. You're not paying any more for it along the way. So that's one thing with the scale. But then there's just the options that it opens up. So sort of going back a little bit, comparing self-managed super fund with one of your industry funds or some of those retail options that are there as well. The wrap accounts is you could go and buy a direct property. Like if you wanted to, you can go and buy the unit on the corner or a commercial property or a shed or whatever that may be. You can rent it out and that can become part of your investment mix, which is something you can't do through the platforms that are available. So you might be able to invest in a property trust, but they're going off and buying all sorts of property you don't have control or clarity over. You could actually go and buy that property. Now, it could be a residential investment property, could be commercial property that you actually lease off yourself. There's a lot of options, and that's where we start to get into the really complex side of the self-managed fund and the benefits it has associated to it.
Yeah, and even those people that are out there thinking, what is the sweet spot for a self-managed super fund? The answer to nearly every one of those questions is it depends. But if you look at those people that can, existing clients, so let's just talk existing clients that seem to have been able to benefit from or have benefited from having their own family or self-managed super fund. Some of them are, or a lot of them are self-employed people. So self-employed people with their own businesses that maybe have a business premises and have the potential at least to have their commercial premises owned in a self-managed super fund and then lease it off the super fund or have the business lease it off the super fund. Again, there's lots of complexity around that, but that's certainly an area that we see people getting great advantage. And I think I mentioned right at the start, like that control and scale. So those people that have significant scale with their assets and have an interest, an understanding of how markets work and how investment assets work, it can certainly be a very viable option for people to consider. And you mentioned something, Ben, around like comparison. Like one of the things that you should expect, like if you are going to see someone and they're talking about the value of a self-managed super fund, one of the things you should expect is that they actually compare, that they actually have a look and go, okay, what are your options? Or your options are you could have an industry fund, you could have a retail super fund, you could have a wholesale super fund, you could have a self-managed super fund. And here are the differences between all four. Here are the cost differences between all four. And back to what we started to say is then helping you make an informed choice about which one of those is going to be suitable. You mentioned something off air. I think at the start was if you go to I think you said, what did you say about a seminar?
Yeah,
I said, don't say that until the podcast.
I suppose one of the things with the process in general is it is a relatively, some would say slow process over a matter of weeks or months because you've got to assess all these options. So pretty simply, if you can walk into a seminar on a Wednesday night at 7 o'clock and be home in bed by 10 o'clock with a self-managed super fund and a property investment in it, probably some red flags and some warning signs going off. And that might sound crazy, but it has happened and it still happens. And
we have multiple examples of having to clean up that mess after the fact.
It's probably a tens of $1,000s pitfall. Like it's massive, maybe hundreds in some circumstances too. Like it is a real mess to undo that. So people get upsold on the dream of here's self-managed super fund, super easy, walk over here, here's the accountant at, seat number 1, roll on to number 2. They can sign you up for their, new property development somewhere in far north Queensland that you'll never actually see get off the ground. And people sound like I wouldn't fall for that. But they're pretty good at what they do, these people. Like they're essentially con men. It's quite a trap. They're sort of trapped in that environment at the time as well. So again, it sounds a bit of a horror show, but it happens. So
keeps coming back to those themes of personal responsibility, Ben, and being able to make informed choices. People are going to get sick of me saying that across multiple podcasts, but I think I lost my train of thought there.
Everyone gets a say in that. Like you're not going to hold a gun to your head, but you feel like you're making a positive choice. You're moving forward with your financials, but have you thought about the alternatives? Like, have you thought about what else could I do to get the same outcome? So for some people, the self-managed super fund, we run all the numbers, all the assessments, and we think, that based on what we know and what we anticipate is the best option. But for a lot of people, it's not, or it's not yet. Like, that's the other thing is, I know we have discussions with clients quite early on about their sort of rolling through their stages. So they might come in at 23, 24, working for a couple of years, modest super balance. Let's keep it simple, low cost, get your contributions happening at a manageable level. Just build the base, build the foundations, spin that off into something a bit more personalised. Maybe you get some direct shares and a bit of a portfolio to get a feel for that. By the time they're up in their 30s, early 30s, then they've got a significant balance, because these days you're getting 10% of your wage paid as super as well. So you get through that point in your early 30s, you've built some scale, but now you've got knowledge because you've had an ongoing relationship. You've got the scale, understanding, you understand where you're at. So then you're in a position to roll through it. And we sort of lay that out early. You don't need to go straight to the kill shot. Like, it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be straight to the self-managed super fund. There's so many steps before that, but it's good to have. I like having that as a goal, because I think it is probably still the place where the highest net wealth people in our country sit generally.
Yeah, and you think about those clients of ours, our existing clients, and I can think just off the top of my head of, a dozen of them that exact scenario is played out, where they've got very good income. So they're high income earners, maybe not a massive super balance at this stage, early stages of their life, are interested in property. And when asked the question of why around property, which we talked about earlier, they say, well, for retirement. So they've got an interest in property, they have a high income, they've got some work to do in terms of building their super. The plan over time is about progressing them through those stages to the point where maybe in a decade, with good effective use of that income, contributing to super regularly, they do have the scale to then look at creating their own family or self-managed super fund, which can then help them buy that property, which they then intend to help fund their retirement. And again, there's a lot of other nuance in that discussion, but actually giving people, not going from zero to hero because you've heard of a self-managed super fund and you've got to get one because your next door neighbours said that they've done it, but say, what are the steps we need to take realistically over time to get you to the point where you can do that safely, and you can do that with the right education and the right support around you. And yeah, we're not shy in saying that we're very big advocates of self-managed super funds for the right people, For the wrong people, we'll just tell them openly, this is not for you.
I think if we went back maybe 3 or 4 years and then looked at how many clients had self-managed super funds at the time then and how many have them now, there wouldn't be a huge growth in the amount, because as people don't need them, you wind them up as well.
Yep.
Like, you get to a point later in life where you don't want the complexity, your scale might have, diminished.
Businesses sold, property sold.
If the need's not there, then we get rid of it too. We've also had multiple clients come to us to fix a mess or to get another opinion after their accountant set one up without, them too much thought years ago. And
are you bashing accountants on this podcast, Ben? You said you've got an accounting background. You can't bash where you came from.
Father-in-law is an accountant, so apologies. There was a period of time where people were setting them up. It was like they were going out for dinner. It was just set one up on a Tuesday and they wouldn't look at it again till the next year. And they just end up funneling a heap of cash into them. You have clients come in, they get $80,000 in a self-managed super fund and 75 of it's in a cash account, and they got 5,000 of BHP shares, and they never did anything with it. It was a hope and a dream, and then they realised this takes time, this is hard. And that's the thing with, unfortunately, maybe with a lot of things in the financial world and industry, it's tricky. Like, it's not easy to transact, establish, maintain, stay compliant at the same time. So that's where I think, as much as it's called a self-managed super fund, I think most of the people that run successful self-managed super funds actually have support around them from administrators, financial planners, accountants, solicitors, as they need them as well.
It's got me thinking about just sort of the expectations. So we might wrap this up as the last topic, but I was thinking about, people's expectations around cost with financial advice. I mean, it was in that article I read at the beginning about the overwhelming cost some people see in actually getting advice. And this is where I think it's really important for people to, again, the more well-informed you are, the better use of the time you have with a financial advisor, the better use of that time will be. And we, with our initial meeting with clients, we charge for that. And so that's one of the reasons why in preparation for those meetings with any advisor, you should come with, as best you can, your A game of all of your information prepared. Make use of that time. If you move on to the next stage of then seeking formal financial advice and paying for it, you want to know that you're actually going to get value. So be prepared. Ask questions. Make sure that you are in a position to be able to work out whether this is a value for you financially, but also whether this is a value for you from a lifestyle perspective. I think balancing those two things out are the things that, or the two of the areas that people really need to consider when they're seeking financial advice.
And again, the industry broadly, it's probably copped a bad rap at times because people have done the wrong thing in the past. So we understand that. And I think people come in with a hesitation at times because of that. And then they think, oh, they're distracting me over here while they gouge me with their other hand in the back behind the scenes with fees or something like that, where ask those questions. So how am I paying, or what am I paying? And we would be very upfront about what we charge for what we do, because we know there's a value in it too. And I think the good thing is from the client base, they quite openly reflect that with their reviews online or their word of mouth referrals, which is why we feel, well, we know that we've got a good trust in what we do and that it works for people. So proof's in the pudding, I suppose.
If you don't believe Ben, you can jump on Google Burke Britton Financial Partners, check the Google reviews. I think we're pretty well received. So that's probably enough from us, Ben. Until next time, thanks for the chat. And thanks again. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're keen to understand more about how financial advice could benefit you, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Burke Britton FP, or Google Burke Britton Financial Partners. Check out our client reviews, testimonials, and make a time to meet one of our certified financial planners by clicking Book Now on our website. Thanks for listening.
Any information contained in this podcast is of a general nature only. No account was taken as to the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Therefore, before making any decision, listeners should consider the appropriateness of any information with regard to their particular objective, financial situation, needs, and seek independent advice from a licensed professional specific to their circumstances.
All right, hit it.
That translates to, don't be a moron and act on what some random person says on a podcast. Take personal responsibility, do your homework, ask questions, and speak to an actual human that knows what they're talking about before you do anything. PB Financial Solutions Proprietary Limited, trading as Burke Britton Financial Partners, are authorised representatives of AMP Financial Planning Limited, AFS, licence number 232706.